Hi, I'm Austin, and this is Animal Quests. Today we're looking at 6 cases of people eaten alive on camera, from a photographer who trusted 15 years of experience at the Mara River to keep him safe, to a wildlife photographer who wrote down his own safety risk before leaving home and went anyway. But first, off the South African coast, a freelance videographer paid a rogue operator to put him in the water, uncaged with a great white shark. The morning of August 14th, 2015 arrived cold and gray over the Western Cape coastline. This stretch of South Africa in the middle of winter carries the weight of the Southern Ocean in long, low swells that flatten inside the bay and leave the surface dark and still. The sky and the water were nearly the same shade that morning, a flat, uniform gray that made the horizon difficult to place. The air off the water had a bite to it that settled in your chest and stayed there. Below the surface, visibility was exceptional. Whatever was down there, a diver could see it clearly. The question, on a morning like that, was whether it would see the diver first. Carl Denton was 33, a freelance underwater videographer from Cape Town who had spent the better part of a decade licensing wildlife footage to nature documentary distributors and travel platforms across Europe and Australia. He was technically capable in the water, fully dive certified, experienced alongside legitimate cage diving operators along the Western Cape coast, and by most professional measures, he was good at his work. What he had not been able to solve was the frame. Cage bars cutting across the image, restricted angles, distance requirements built into every licensed operator's protocol that kept him just far enough from the subject to produce footage that was technically competent, but not the kind of footage that separated one videographer from another. He had been trying to close that gap for 3 years. By the summer of 2015, he had found what he believed was the solution. A contact had pointed him toward an operator working out of a small private harbor near Mossel Bay, who offered what he described as open water shark encounters. No cage, no distance protocol, no licensing oversight. The pricing was above market. The paperwork was a single liability waiver that would not have held up in any court that examined it closely. The operator ran these dives quietly, word of mouth only, and carried the easy confidence of someone who had gotten away with something enough times to stop believing it was dangerous. Carl had spent 3 years convinced that access was the only thing standing between him and the footage he wanted. He paid, signed, and drove down the coast. On the morning of August 14th, the operator began chumming 40 minutes before Carl entered the water. A slow release of scent bleeding into the current and trailing into open water. Carl suited up, rolled in, and the GoPro rig on his chest began recording. The secondary camera, mounted to the boat's stern rail, pointed down toward the water. For the first several minutes, the water around him was empty. Then, at the edge of visibility roughly 40 feet out, a shape appeared. Large, wide-bodied, moving in slow arcs that seemed almost indifferent. A great white, mature and well over 14 feet, making wide passes at a distance that held steady, long enough for Carl to begin reading them as a pattern. He started swimming toward it, cutting distance with each pass, trying to position himself ahead of the arc where the light was better and the angle was cleaner. He pushed further from the boat, 50 feet, then closer to 80. And here's what I keep coming back to with this. Carl wasn't just moving toward the shark. Every foot he swam in that direction was a foot further from the only thing that could have pulled him out. Great white sharks are not random in their approach. When they shift from open water movement into pre-strike behavior, the change is visible in the geometry. The arcs tighten, the passes come closer, and the intervals between them shorten. It is not aggression in the conventional sense. It is assessment. The animal narrows distance across multiple passes, each one a data point in a decision already underway. By the time that decision finalizes, the interval between the last pass and the strike is shorter than the human reaction window. Carl had been in the water for just over 20 minutes when he turned his back to open water to adjust a seal on his camera housing. Both hands on the equipment, attention on the housing, not on the water behind him. The shark's arcs had been tightening for the previous 10 minutes. The last visible pass had brought it to under 30 feet. The strike came from below in a single upward burst, the full mechanical force of a 14-foot animal at attack speed, accelerating from depth in the direction Carl was not facing. The bite was immediate and catastrophic. His GoPro was still recording. On the boat, the operator saw the water change behind Carl's position and opened the throttle. The operator reached Carl within 2 minutes. The injuries from a single full-speed strike by an animal of that size were not survivable. Carl Denton died before he could be brought aboard. Local police and marine regulatory authorities launched an investigation. The operator was later identified, his vessel impounded, and charges were filed for negligent conduct and operating without required licensing. Both cameras, the GoPro and the stern unit, were surrendered to investigators and classified as evidence. Neither was released to the public. Carl's family in Cape Town was notified through local police. A brief obituary ran in a Cape Town photography trade publication the following week. Carl had believed the problem was access. In the end, access was exactly what killed him. But if Carl's story is about a man who went looking for something no barrier could give him, the next story belongs to a man who had been getting that same thing, legally, for 15 years, until the last morning he sat down at the waterline to get it again. The morning of July 23, 2016 came in hot and bright along the Mara River. July in the Masai Mara sits at the heart of the dry season. The grass along the riverbanks pressed flat and pale, the water running low and murky brown, the crossing points already marked by the slow accumulation of wildebeest at the tree line on the far side. The Mara River during the Great Migration is one of the most photographed stretches of water on Earth. It is also one of the most dangerous. The two things are connected, and the people who know it best tend to stop registering that connection over time. Stefan Brovik was 41, a freelance wildlife photographer from Stockholm who had been making the trip to the Mara every July for 15 years. He sold images to Scandinavian nature magazines, travel publications, and a small number of European wildlife foundations, and the river crossing was the axis around which his entire professional year rotated. He knew this river the way people know the roads they have driven for years. The crossing points, the light at different hours, the positions that produced the images other photographers weren't getting. That knowledge had served him well. It had also, over 15 seasons, built a layer of familiarity that had quietly replaced a layer of caution. His shooting positions had been creeping closer to the waterline for years, a few inches each season. The lower angle put the river surface in frame, made the animals feel bigger, turned a competent wildlife image into something else. By 2016, he was no longer hiring licensed guides. He traveled with a local fixer instead, a man who drove him to the positions Stefan identified and waited at the vehicle. The fixer had no wildlife training, carried no radio, and understood his role as transportation, not safety. Several photographers Stefan had worked alongside at the crossing over the years had made comments about his bank positions, not alarmist, just observations. Stefan had heard them and continued anyway. The images had kept selling. That was the only metric he had applied. On July 23rd, Stefan chose a low mud bank at a section of river he had used before. He set his tripod-mounted DSLR 6 to 8 inches from the water's edge and dropped into a seated position directly on the bank, crouched low over the camera body, his face close to the viewfinder, holding the eye-level angle that made the crossing images work. He wore his shoulder-strap camera for handheld work. The crossing had been building since before dawn, and the river was full of wildebeest, the crocodile aggregation already active in the main channel. A local fisherman passed on foot about 40 minutes into the session, stopped, and spoke urgently in Swahili, gesturing at the water beside Stefan's position. Stefan waved him off without looking up from the viewfinder. Stefan had been at that river for 15 years. That fisherman wasn't telling him anything he hadn't already heard. He just wasn't listening to any of it. Nile crocodiles during active feeding aggregations do not all work the main channel. Some hold secondary positions along the bank margins, pressed flat beneath mud overhangs, invisible from the surface above, stationary for extended periods while the activity in the main channel draws attention away from the edges. They do not need to move far. The bank itself can be within their strike range. A person seated at the waterline, face close to a camera, is not looking at the water directly below them. A large crocodile had been holding position beneath the mud bank overhang directly below Stefan's tripod, not out in the channel, but tight to the bank margin, within striking distance of the surface above it. Stefan leaned forward over the camera to adjust his focus ring. The crocodile surged upward from less than 3 feet away. At that distance, from a seated position, Stefan had no interval in which to react. The fixer heard the impact from 60 feet back at the vehicle. He ran forward and found the bank empty. He did not enter the water. He drove to the nearest ranger post and reported what he had seen. Local wildlife authorities launched a search that afternoon. Stefan's body was recovered downstream 2 days later, at a location consistent with how the river moves things in the hours after dark. The camera had been knocked sideways by the strike and remained near the bank. His shoulder camera was recovered beside it. Both devices were submitted to investigators and not released. The absence of a licensed guide was noted formally in the incident report. One of the Scandinavian magazines he had worked with for over a decade published a brief tribute the following month. Stefan Brovik had been reading the Mara River for 15 years. He had stopped reading the space directly beneath his own hands. The next story is not about a professional who pushed too close to something he had spent years around, It is about someone who had no experience with any of it, who camped alone at night in active predator territory, in an area he had no framework to read, and stepped outside into the dark with a camera because he thought that was the reasonable thing to do. The evening of March 9th, 2017, sat warm and still over the Serengeti periphery. This far out from the established park boundary, 4 miles from the nearest official entry point, the bush thinned into scrub acacia and dry grass flats that ran without feature in every direction. By the time the last light went out of the sky, the temperature had dropped enough to make the fire feel necessary. The sounds that came out of the dark past the firelight's edge were not the sounds of silence. They were the sounds of things moving. Marcus Ellie was 29, an adventure travel blogger from Austin, Texas. He ran a YouTube channel built around off-grid travel, bush camping, and the concept of getting as far from the tourist infrastructure as possible. He had been in East Africa for 3 weeks, moving progressively further from organized tourist circuits with each stop, a pattern he understood as content strategy. He was a capable camper in the American backcountry sense. He understood fire, solo navigation, and basic camp logistics. He had no training in African wildlife behavior and no meaningful experience with the specific dynamics of camping in active predator range. On March 9th, he drove off a gravel access road in the late afternoon and set up camp in an undesignated clearing well outside the Serengeti's western boundary. He cooked a full meal over an open fire, meat from a roadside market earlier in the day, and left the remaining scraps in a loose plastic bag tied to the roof rack of his vehicle rather than sealed in a hard container. Before turning in, he set his trail camera on a small tripod pointed at the dying fire and angled to capture movement through the camp. He considered spotted hyenas low-risk scavengers, manageable background wildlife. That assessment was wrong in both respects. Spotted hyenas are apex predators, not scavengers. They hunt and kill the majority of their own food. A clan operating in the Serengeti periphery in March is typically in an active hunting pattern. They are communicative and coordinated, capable of surrounding a location before engaging. They are not deterred by artificial light. A headlamp does not register as a threat and does not cause a committed pack to retreat. Their bite force is the strongest of any land carnivore relative to body size, sufficient to crush bone in a single application of pressure. At approximately 11 at night, a pack of spotted hyenas moved into the camp perimeter. The trail camera had already been recording movement at the edges of the clearing for several minutes before Marcus woke, shapes pausing at the outer ring of the dying firelight, circling, testing the space. Marcus reached for his personal camera, activated his headlamp, and unzipped the tent. He moved toward the sounds at the perimeter, rather than toward the vehicle. He was in the open, on foot, away from any structure, with a headlamp that provided visibility but no deterrent, moving directly toward the part of the clearing the pack had already distributed itself around. The trail camera continued recording. The personal camera was rolling in his hand. Neither device changed anything about what happened next. This is the moment I keep coming back to with Marcus's case. The vehicle was 60 feet away. He walked in the other direction. Spotted hyenas do not close in from a single direction. The pack had already positioned animals on multiple sides of the clearing before Marcus left the tent. When he moved toward the sound on one edge, the animals behind him and to his flanks were already in motion. As he pivoted toward movement near the fire ring, his foot caught one of the tent lines and he stumbled sideways into the dirt. The first contact came a second later, a bite to the back of the upper leg, the jaws locking with the crushing force that is specific to the species. The impact kept him down. The pack did not hesitate after the initial contact. Multiple animals were on him within seconds, and the combination of bites and the force of the animals pulling in different directions meant that Marcus never regained his footing. He did not reach the vehicle. Marcus had arranged a scheduled satellite check-in with a contact in Austin for the following morning. When the check-in went unanswered into the following afternoon, his contact reached out through emergency channels to local authorities. A ranger response was organized and the team reached the camp by evening. Marcus's trail camera had recorded audio and partial visual footage from the initial approach through the full sequence. His personal camera was recovered in the grass approximately 18 feet from his tent, the recording still running when found. Both devices were surrendered to the investigating authorities. His remains were recovered at the scene and transferred to the regional center. The footage from both cameras was retained as part of the investigation file and was not publicly released. Marcus had walked toward the sound because he believed he was the one doing the filming. The next story happened somewhere without a tour group or a rented vehicle or an unlicensed operator. It happened on a footpath between rows of sugarcane that one man had walked hundreds of times before on a Tuesday evening close to home. The evening of November 8, 2016 came in slow and humid along the Sahyadri forest edge in rural Maharashtra. The sugarcane at this time of year stood well above head height, dense, close-planted rows that pressed in on the narrow field paths and reduced visibility to the few feet of ground immediately ahead. The light was already failing when Arjun Desai left his house. It was a familiar walk. He had done it most of his adult life. That familiarity was not a warning. It was the reason he went. Arjun Desai was 52, a sugarcane farmer who had worked the same plot of land in rural Maharashtra for over 20 years. He was steady and practical in the way that farmers tend to be, familiar with the land, familiar with the forest line that pressed against his fields on the eastern side, and familiar with the routine of checking his irrigation lines before dark. He had raised 2 sons on this land. He was not a man who sought risk. He was a man for whom this field was, after 2 decades, simply part of the day. In the weeks before November 8th, a leopard had been moving through the area at dusk, drawn by feral dog and livestock activity near the village edge. Sightings had been reported by several villagers over a 3-week period, with 2 incidents involving the leopard in adjacent fields after sunset. Local wildlife officials had circulated an advisory through the village asking residents to avoid the field paths after sunset, to travel in groups when working near the forest boundary, and to report any further sightings. The advisory had been passed person to person and was known throughout the village. Arjun was aware of it. On the evening of November 8th, he walked out to check a section of irrigation piping before the light went entirely. His neighbor, working on the elevated berm of an adjacent field, watched him start down the path between the cane rows. The neighbor noticed movement in the stalks to Arjun's left and raised his mobile phone. What I want to point out here, because it matters, is that Arjun wasn't doing anything reckless. He was doing what he had done every evening of his adult life. That's what makes this one so hard to sit with. Leopards are ambush hunters. They do not pursue prey across open ground. They wait within concealment, close enough that the distance between stillness and contact can be covered before the target registers any change. Their preferred point of contact is the back of the neck. The first bite is typically placed at the cervical region with the intent of disorienting and collapsing the target immediately. They drag prey into cover within seconds of making contact, pulling it out of the open before any response can reach the scene. The path between the cane rows was narrow. The crop on both sides stood over 6 feet, reducing visibility to the path directly in front. The leopard had been stationary in the cane to Arjun's left, positioned with its body oriented toward the path. Arjun was walking, unhurried, focused on the ground ahead of him. The leopard came out of the cane at close range in a single low burst. The first contact was to the back of his neck and upper shoulder, the targeted strike that leopards use to collapse prey immediately, the jaws driving into the cervical region with the full closing force of the animal's bite. Arjun went down onto the path. The leopard adjusted its grip and began pulling him backward into the cane, dragging his body laterally off the path and into the dense rows within seconds of the initial contact. The neighbor, positioned on the elevated berm of the adjacent field, was already shouting by the time the cane closed over where Arjun had been standing. Other villagers responded within minutes of hearing the commotion. Arjun was located inside the cane and pulled out, but the injuries to his neck and upper body were severe and unresponsive to the pressure and first aid the villagers could apply. The nearest hospital was a significant distance from the village on rural roads. Medical help arrived too late. Arjun Desai died at the scene. Wildlife officials reached the village the following morning, documented the tracks and attack pattern, set cage traps along the field perimeter, and confirmed a leopard was responsible. The leopard was captured and removed from the agricultural boundary zone. The neighbor's mobile phone footage was reviewed by officials and local police as part of their formal documentation. It was not released publicly at the request of Arjun's family. His wife and 2 adult sons continued working the land. In the months that followed, warning signage was installed along the field paths bordering the forest edge, and the advisory period was extended through the end of the dry season, when leopard movement in the agricultural boundary remained elevated. Arjun Desai died on a path he had walked his whole life. The next story happened on a marked trail, with a licensed ranger 20 feet ahead. It happened because one man decided that 20 feet was too much distance between himself and what he had come to see. The morning of May 17, 2013 arrived bright and still over Rinka Island. At this hour, the heat was already present, not oppressive yet, but settled, the kind of warmth that would build steadily through the morning and become serious by midday. The island sat quiet in the way that remote places do in the early hours, the scrub vegetation dry and gray-green against a white sky, the paths between the trees packed hard and pale from years of guided foot traffic. It was the kind of morning that looked entirely benign. Most of the mornings here did. Brett Callahan was 44, a recently retired high school science teacher from Phoenix, Arizona. He had spent 30 years teaching biology biology and earth science, and had retired early with the specific intention of spending a year traveling through Southeast Asia, photographing the wildlife he had spent his career describing from textbooks. He was thoughtful and genuinely enthusiastic about the natural world in the way that people who have taught it for decades often are, knowledgeable in a broad framework sense, comfortable with the vocabulary, and accustomed to being the most informed person in the room on the topic. He had been traveling for 4 months by May 2013 and had moved through that time without incident. That unbroken run had produced, gradually, a quiet confidence in his own judgment that had started to sit slightly above the actual weight of his experience. He had wanted to photograph Komodo dragons since before the trip began. He booked the standard boat transfer to Rinca Island, joined a small, licensed walking tour with a park ranger, and arrived on the trail with his DSLR around his neck and a wristband-mounted wide-angle camera for ambient footage. He had read enough to know the rules. Stay in the group. Follow the ranger. Do not approach the animals independently. He understood the rules clearly. He had simply, over 4 months of uneventful travel, stopped fully applying them to himself. At several earlier stops on the trip, he had drifted from groups, lingered at sites after guides had moved others along, and gotten the images he wanted without consequence. Each time had reinforced the same conclusion, that the rules were calibrated for the average tourist, and that he was not that. Approximately 40 minutes into the tour, the group passed a large adult Komodo dragon resting in the shade off the path, a well-used viewing spot, the animal accustomed to groups passing at distance. The ranger moved the tour forward. Brett slowed, adjusting his lens settings, framing the animal through the trees. The gap between him and the rest of the group opened, 15 feet, then 20. When the group rounded a bend in the trail, Brett was effectively alone with the dragon. He crouched down to get a low, ground-level perspective, the DSLR raised to his eye. Then he shifted slightly to his left, 2 or 3 feet closer, to improve the frame. 2 or 3 feet. That's what this entire story comes down to. Everything that follows, Brett's death, the protocol change at that park, all of it, starts with 2 or 3 feet. Komodo dragons are capable of accelerating from a stationary position to approximately 12 miles per hour in a single explosive burst. They are significantly more likely to engage targets that are isolated, low to the ground, and moving laterally at close range. A crouching person shifting position is, in terms of the behavioral triggers that prompt a Komodo dragon to attack, a near-optimal combination. Their venom contains anticoagulant compounds that interfere with the blood's normal clotting process, causing wounds to bleed freely and continuously, despite the application of pressure. The dragon had not been asleep. It had been watching the group pass. Brett, alone and crouching and moving laterally at close range, presented a profile that resolved a decision the animal had not yet made about the group. It launched in a single forward burst before Brett could process the shift from stillness to motion. The strike hit his lower leg and foot. The teeth curved inward on contact, a bite structure designed to prevent immediate withdrawal, and the initial injury was severe. Brett's camera remained around his neck throughout. The ranger heard the commotion from 40 feet ahead on the trail, turned back immediately, and radioed for assistance. He used his forked wooden staff, the standard tool rangers carry at Rinca for exactly this purpose, to maintain distance between Brett and the dragon after the animal disengaged. Brett had deep lacerations across his lower leg and foot, and the bleeding would not respond to pressure. The depth of the lacerations, combined with the anticoagulant effects present in Komodo dragon venom, made controlling the bleeding extremely difficult. The park's emergency response boat was dispatched and Brett was transferred to a regional medical facility on the mainland. The travel time between Rinca and any facility capable of the intervention he needed was measured in hours, not minutes. Brett Callahan died from blood loss before definitive surgical treatment could be completed. His DSLR and wristband camera were both recovered on the trail by the ranger and submitted to park authorities as part of the incident investigation. They were not released. U.S. diplomatic officials assisted with family notification. The park formalized a revised group count protocol for Rinca tours the following year. Rangers required to verify the full group count at every waypoint on the trail, and any visitor who falls behind is to be stopped and held until the group can consolidate. Brett had spent 30 years teaching students that understanding an animal and being safe around one, he forgot, on a quiet trail on a warm May morning, which of the two he had actually spent 30 years practicing. The last story belongs to a man who understood both skills and had practiced both. He made a deliberate decision, documented in his own notes, to go without the one that mattered. The morning of September 5th, 2018 came in cold and clear over Ejoya Island. The Arctic in early September has a particular quality to it, the light low and angled even at midday, the air sharp enough to feel on your face at rest. The coastal terrain a flat gray-brown expanse of rock and frost-killed scrub running to the waterline. The Svalbard archipelago at this time of year is past the midnight sun and moving toward the long dark. The walrus colonies along the southern coast of Edgeoya were active, the beach below the ridge lines busy with movement. It was exactly the kind of location that a nature photographer specializing in Arctic wildlife would plan a trip around. Owen Hurst was 38, a freelance nature photographer from Edinburgh, Scotland, who had built the past 5 years of his career around Arctic and subarctic wildlife work. He had traveled to Svalbard twice before on organized commercial expeditions, both times with licensed operators, armed guides, and the full range of protocols that Svalbard polar bear country requires. He knew what the protocols were and why they existed. His previous trips had produced some of the strongest work of his career, and both had been conducted entirely within the guidelines those expeditions imposed. For his third Svalbard trip in September 2018, he had arranged a private charter with a single boat operator, trading the structure of an organized expedition for flexibility over location and timing. He believed the flexibility would produce better images. He carried no firearm. Svalbard regulation requires anyone leaving settlements in polar bear habitat to carry adequate means of deterrence. Owen had made a deliberate decision to rely on the flare gun his boat operator carried, a choice he had documented in his own trip notes, with the acknowledged understanding that a flare gun is a marginal deterrent at close range and would not stop a committed charge. Here's the detail about Owen's case that stays with me. He wrote that down. In his own notes, weeks before leaving Scotland, he acknowledged that the flare gun wouldn't stop a committed charge. He knew, and he went anyway. He had 3 productive days on Edgeoya photographing the walrus colony. On the morning of September 5th, he spotted a large male polar bear on the ridge above the beach, several hundred feet of elevation and roughly a quarter mile along the coast. He set up his camera on a monopod and began photographing from a stationary position on the beach below. The GoPro mounted to his jacket was running for ambient footage. Over the following 90 minutes, Owen worked along the beach below the ridge, following the bear's movement, drawn by the shifting light and the changing angle. With each reposition he was, without fully accounting for it, closing the distance to the ridge base. He read the bear's movement along the ridge line as lateral transit, the animal moving parallel to the coast, not toward him. It paused occasionally, its head oriented toward the beach. Each time it resumed moving, Owen resumed repositioning. Polar bears are the only large predator on Earth that consistently and actively hunts humans as genuine prey, not as a defensive response, not as a result of food conditioning, but as documented predatory behavior specific to the species and recorded extensively in Svalbard incident. Reports: a polar bear that begins moving toward a human on open coastal terrain is, in the overwhelming majority of documented encounters, not bluffing. The species is built for sustained pursuit, capable of running at over 25 miles per hour across uneven ground, and capable of detecting a human by scent at distances exceeding 1 mile. Parallel movement along elevated terrain before a charge is a recognized behavioral pattern in Svalbard polar bear attack documentation. When Owen had repositioned to within approximately 200 feet of the ridge base, the bear stopped its lateral movement, oriented its full body downhill, and descended at a run. At 25 miles per hour, 200 feet closes in under 6 seconds. Owen raised his camera. The jacket GoPro was still recording. The boat operator, watching from offshore through binoculars, fired the flare gun when the bear committed to the charge. The bear did not stop. The operator could not get the vessel's tender to shore in time. Owen's monopod camera was knocked to the sand during the attack and continued recording from a low angle before the lens was obscured. Both cameras were recovered by Norwegian authorities in the hours that followed. Norwegian territorial authorities dispatched an investigation team and conducted a formal review of the incident. Consistent with local protocol following a fatal polar bear attack, the bear was located and euthanized. A brief formal incident statement was released confirming a fatal encounter on Edgeoya and the launch of a formal investigation. Camera footage from both devices was submitted to the investigation and was not released. Owen's family in Edinburgh was notified through British diplomatic officials. The investigation report, completed the following spring, identified the absence of a firearm as the critical gap in Owen's deterrence plan and formally recommended expanding the armed escort requirement to cover private single-vessel charter arrangements operating in documented polar bear habitat. The specific arrangement Owen had used to justify the decision he had written down in his own notes weeks before leaving Scotland. He had known the flare gun wasn't enough. He had written that down too. The report that followed his death ensured that the next photographer who chartered a private vessel to Edgeoya would not be able to make the same argument. It was the closest thing to an outcome that the situation allowed.